Stan Laurel have a special talent for creating. People chuckle at his charisma as a component of Laurel and Hardy, the legendary comedic pair. Continues to have resonance today, yet behind those he chuckles that he had a difficult life. That was much more than most fans were aware of. From devastating personal losses to fights on the professional level, Stan's life was not at all simple, and it was among the most. He was suffering terrible blows and losing his son to death's terrible clutches, but prior to delving into the suffering and loss, we should pause to recall the wonderful times in Stan Laurel's life, including he made millions of people laugh, and the complete image of the individual behind the Arthur Stanley Jefferson's comedy, or as later, the world would know him as Stan. On June 16, 1890, Laurel was born in his Ulverston, at the grandparents' residence. His parents, Arthur J. Jefferson and Lancaster, a traveling theatrical manager and performer, and actress Margaret, were too preoccupied performing while on the fly to raise a baby thus. During his early years, Stan lived with Sarah Metcalf and George Metcalf, his grandparents, and becoming rather close to the town of Ulverston. Stan wasn't merely loitering. He was playing with toys and taking in the sights and sounds of a church service at Holy Trinity with his grandparents, and seemingly becoming seriously sweet appetite for trickle toffee beer from the affection of a Gillam's General Store fan. Because the stage began immediately across the block from the home of his grandparents it was a hippodromium theater with a wooden canvas canopy where his parents' actions, his father would grow a few of the plays for which he had gained fame. Therefore, during Stan's childhood, he wasn't merely having fun on the streets, was taking in performances and receiving familiar with the theater's magic. Unfortunately, the Hippodromium burned in 1910 down, but Stan sailed that same year for America, but that will be discussed in a. For a while, the movie fan lived with Sarah Metcalf, his grandmother, in North Shields, before going to King James-style schools, the King and the First Grammar School. After a while, his family left school and went to Glasgow, where Stan's father lived, was in charge of the Metropole Theatre. Stan truly caught the bug here, for when he was 16, he entered the theatre industry, giving his first employment at the Panopticon Inn. This was also the time in Glasgow when he most likely understood that receiving compensation to making others laugh was a quite charming transaction. In 1910, when Stan was 20 years old, joined the squadron of Fred Carnot, adopting the Stan Jefferson stage name, is where things became very fascinating, due to the fact that his fellow soldier wasn't Charlie Chaplin. Yes, it was just anybody. The two legends of the future were on the road, surrounding slapstick comedic performances and probably attempting to outsmart one another. Stan even had the opportunity to serve as chaplains. Both understudies boarded the same sail to the United States, and the remainder is history of comedy. When the world was at, Stan enlisted in the military. However, because of his deafness and his status as a resident alien, he received a complimentary. He wasn't going to allow it to pass. Anything that prevents him from being a comedian. Glory following the Carnot troupe. Stan was dissolved in the spring of 1914. Did more than simply wait for his next major collaboration was with a couple of other former Carnot artists. Hurley, Edgar, his spouse Ethel, and they joined together to form the Three Comics on. Following their booking agent's guidance, they chose to change their name to the Keystone Trio. Pays homage to the well-known Keystone Cops, who were extremely popular in funny at the moment. In this stage, Stan began to play around with his persona, mimicking his previous friend Charlie Chaplin. In the meantime, Hurley started portraying the roles of Chester Conklin and other silent film stars. Mabel Normand and their great tour. February through October of 1915, but the three parted ways eventually, and Stan left for new experiences between 1916 and Stan joined forces with Alice Cook in 1918 and to form the Stan Jefferson, Baldwin Cook. Nevertheless, this collaboration went beyond simply Baldwin and Alice would perform on stage, become buddies for life, but in 1921, Stan's journey intersected with another. Oliver Hardy is a significant figure who collaborated on The Silence for a short time. The Lucky Dog was brief, but it wasn't yet the renowned collaboration that we are all familiar with and adore. Stan also met around this period May Dolberg, an actress who proposed that Stan Jefferson was his stage name. Unfortunate because it contains 13 letters, so similar to any competent superstitious actor. Stan adopted Laurel as his stage name and made a fresh start shortly after. Laurel received a weekly offer of $75 to appear in. He jumped at the first of two genuine comedies chance following the production of his debut movie. In May, Nuts in May, Universal gave him a contract, but as is customary in Hollywood, that contract was short-lived. Due to a studio reorganization, it was cancelled, but Stan was unfazed. And May co-starred in a number of movies such as the satire Mud from 1922 and Sand was a movie with its own distinct style of absurdity. By 1924, Stan had completely devoted to the film industry, signing a deal to star in 12-2 with Joe Rock. Genuine comedies, there existed a peculiar clause included in this contract. May Dolberg was prohibited from participating in. Joe Rock thought that any of these movies thought Stan was being held back by her temperament. Thus, in 1925, when May began obstructing Stan's work, Rock promised her a payoff in cash as well as a return ticket to her hometown. Acceptance in Australia was possible, and that was the termination of their collaboration, but Stan's career was only beginning from. Stan shot a number of films between 1924 and 1925. Humorous films such as Mandarin Mix-Up and Imprisoned, and by 1925 he had either. Despite this, he co-directed 10 silent shorts. Didn't show up in them himself, but Hardy did make his eventual comedy partner. Yes, participation in 3 of these films. Nanette Wandering, yeah, Madam and Papa. The career of Mystery Laurel was consistently proceeding, even though it wasn't quite the formidable pair, but the wheels were underway so that he and Hardy might become one of the best comedy teams. The next major step for all-time fan Laurel in his professional life when he joined at initially, Hal Roach Studios had impressive want to concentrate on directing and writing. And in 1925 he even directed a movie referred to as Yes Yes Nanette. In that movie, Oliver Hardy, his future comedy partner, had a function as Babe Hardy on stage, but that year, life had other intentions. A member of the Hal Roach, Hardy. The comedic all-stars from the studio got into a incident in the kitchen and ended up in the Hardy's hospital is no longer operational. Stan was requested to take over and perform in the This is where the movie Get Him Young comes in. Taking a turn, Oliver and Stan started collaborating on the screen and the magic began to occur around the beginning of 1927. Hardy and Laurel were frequently seen on screen. Together, they starred in a number of short films, such as Slipping Wives and Duck Soup. The connection between love and hisses was indisputable, and it took little time for the Roach Studios staff to take note how the viewers reacted to their Leo McCarey, director of Antics, seeing the potential started to pair them up more, often resulting in the birth of later, the renowned Laurel and Hardy series. The squad swiftly rose to prominence that year as one of the most popular comedians of the silent film period, producing a strong assortment of shorts such as The Battle of Should Married Men Return Home in the Century, Big Business and Two Tears Be Big. Had a beat so organic that even the 1929 switch to talkies didn't slow them in their very first sound movie. We Are Unaccustomed was popular, and their initial appearance was in a later that year, a feature film as a component of the Hollywood Review sequence evaluation of 1929, the year after they appeared in full-color Technicolor. Laurel's 1931 musical The Rogue Song. And Hardy achieved yet another significant milestone with starring in their first full-length film, Please Pardon Us, and they maintained the pace, going to make shorts and features. Their 1932 short, The Music, until 1935. They even won an Academy Award for box. They won for Best Short Subject of the comedic gold dot of the world, but as anyone who has ever struck a high note is aware of, nothing in the world can remain flawless forever. Things were a little difficult for Stan in the 1930s. Hal Roach and Laurel Roach had a disagreements over contract matters, and that caused a significant argument that Roach had separate agreements for Hardy and Laurel, having various expiration dates. This indicated that even if Laurel's contract was, Roach kept Hardy at his house because Hardy's wasn't up the studio and matched him with additional Harry Langdon and other comedians for the in the 1939 movie Zenobia, there was even discussion about establishing a new Hardy series. And the Hardy family was contacted by Paddy Kelly. Laurel refused to put up with this, so he sued Roach for breach of contract. Eventually, the legal dispute ended when Laurel came back to Roach Studios. Nevertheless, the partnership was never quite the same. Likewise, it won't be long until both Hardy and Laurel agreed that it was time to leave Roach permanently by 1941. Hardy and Laurel made a deal with Fox has agreed to produce 10 movies over 5 years, but Laurel's. Surprisingly, the two were employed solely as actors' lack of artistic authority over the composing, directing, or editing the movies. It was very different from the imaginative. The liberty they were accustomed to at Roach remained. The movies were popular, and as their Laurel's success increased, and Hardy's, they gradually started adding more flexibility, their own resources, and creating these movies more intimate. They would proceed to turn became one of the most recognizable pairs in history of entertainment, but as the star was more brilliant than before. On August 7, 1957, disaster struck. When Oliver Hardy passed away in 1957, he took a portion of one of the most popular comedies duos in history. Stan Laurel was informed. Laurel had been hit in the stomach and had lost his creative collaborator, dearest pal, and actually the only individual who actually recognized the odd, dazzling rhythm. They disclosed that he was too sick to go to the funeral, but in a silently tragic "Baby would understand," he said. Additionally, if you were aware of their bond, you would be aware that was most likely the case. However, Hardy's passing wasn't simply the conclusion of a business collaboration, it signified the Laurel's performance career came to an end despite getting requests to get back on stage and screen. He flipped each one down. Not with arrogance or obstinacy, but because he was merely uninterested in working for Laurel. The act without Hardy was different in the absence of Babe, and to be honest, nothing was ever truly again. Despite how terrible that loss was, it was far from the sole misfortune Laurel experienced. Carry his personal life, which was full with too much chaos and sad drama. A man who created them was visible to the world. Laugh, but they failed to notice how much he persevered after the spotlight faded. Behind the slapstick of Stan Laurel, brilliant and recognizable bowler hat, was a man whose private life frequently seemed more not so much a comedy as a tragic melodrama. As viewers chuckled at his on-screen, Laurel's antics were discreetly carrying the burden of heartache, shame, and profound personal grief that isn't worse than the tragic death of his baby son. The history of Laurel's relationships alone seems to be taken from a soap show. He never got married to his early May Dolberg, their lover, yet they survived, beginning in 1919 as common-law spouses. Dahlberg was instrumental up until 1925 she even assisted in the invention of his early career. Stan Laurel's stage name, but when Joe Rock, the producer, determined that Dahlberg was impeding Laurel's career advancement, he purchased a one-way ticket for her return to. She departed Australia, but the drama didn't finish there. In 1937, more than 10 years later, Dahlberg went back to the U.S. and filed a lawsuit. Laurel for monetary assistance, as he was undergoing a challenging divorce. The lawsuit also mentioned his second wife. Insult to harm, and even if the situation was resolved out of court by the general public, spectacle was an additional sour note in an already disorganized personal symphony, but not even close to what transpired in May. Lois Nielsen, Laurel's first wife, in 1930, had welcomed a second kid into their family. Stanley Robert Laurel is a youngster who arrived 2 months ahead of schedule. The couple held on to hope, but sadly, baby 9 days after his birth, Stanley passed away. For a man whose whole professional life was about making other people laugh and smile, this loss was a personal and heartbreaking grief. Laurel never talked much about one openly, but which surely left no amount of slapstick or deep scar. Applause might make that Laurel's pain go away. The marriage kept degenerating into a complex string of unions and remarriages following the 1934 divorce from Lois. In 1935, he wed Virginia Ruth Rogers. That swiftly collapsed, he acknowledged. Remained attracted to Lois, but she had no desire to rekindle things. Ilana Shuvalova then arrived in a stormy union that ended with accusations as Laurel's reckless attempt to bury her alive. The marriage that ended in the backyard. It burned in 1940 before perhaps going out. Laurel remarried Virginia Ruth out of habit. Rogers once more before divorcing her for the second time, in 1946, he. Ida Katieva Raphael, who would be with him until the conclusion of his life despite all the public calamities, personal sorrows and making headlines. Stan Laurel continued to appear on divorces. Smile on the television, yet behind that. The man who smiled had been through more than his share of suffering, losing a youngster who consistently loses love and ultimately losing his closest creative. It was a tragic life depicted in it, partner. Black and white, similar to the movies that. After the curtains, he became a star. Shut down the renowned Laurel and Hardy collaboration. Stan Laurel subtly stepped out of the spotlight, but not from the attention, the affection of his followers or the regard of his peers, but his performance days were. His legacy kept expanding behind him. Despite living in humble circumstances. The Academy of Motion Pictures in 1961. Laurel's work was acknowledged by Arts and Sciences. Significant contribution to humor with an Oscar in recognition of his innovative leading the way in the comedy film genre. But too weak to go to the ceremony. Laurel's influence on him was. Unquestionably, Bob Hope presented the prize. And Danny Kaye took it in his place. A heartfelt gesture that conveyed a lot. Regarding how much cherished and esteemed. Laurel continued to be part of the entertainment world, even though it was featured in almost 190 movies. Laurel spent his last years, not in a house in Hollywood, but in a modest apartment in the renowned Oceanana Apartments in Santa Monica. Had not spoiled him, rather, Laurel maintained. His phone number is publicly available. Directory and commonly asked questions. Called himself, and he was proud of his response. Receiving fan messages while maintaining their humility. That had won him millions of fans. If we were fortunate enough to call him, he could simply call and converse as if you were an old friend. Comedians who were his successors frequently looked to him as a mentor. Jerry Lewis paid him a visit, but he also. Laurel's influence was included into the bellboy identifying the protagonist. Stanley and adding a figure. Inspired by Bill's portrayal of Laurel. Van DJ Case Richmond Dick had a comparable Van DJ Case experience as a young performer. Contacted Laurel after finding his number and was asked to come visit later. Van DJK honored him by depicting him in an Dick Van DJK show episode. These weren't merely expressions of gratitude, they were recognitions of Laurel's. Their work's humorous DNA persisted when Stanley Kramer, the filmmaker, presented Laurel with made an appearance in It's a Mad 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 World. Alongside other legendary comedians like The Three Stooges and Buster Keaton. Laurel declined because he was determined regarding not showing up on screen without. According to reports, he and Hardy didn't want to be observed in his later years. His devotion to his the late partner remained steadfast, and a background shot was planned with a subtle hint showcasing a double wearing Laurel's recognizable bowler hat sitting in an antique convertible, but even that little homage was eventually altered to include the cameo visiting Jack Benny, who was wearing Laurel's Stan, the last cut in the conclusion. Perhaps Laurel moved away from the camera, but he didn't actually leave the platform. He guided the fans through the comics. He was thrilled, and the classic movies Laurel was left behind as an eternal figure in the realm of quiet laughter. Polite and still striving for perfection. Joking all the whole through and talking. Near the end of his life, Stan Laurel devoted his silent last years away from the spotlight that had previously followed him. By the middle of the 1960s, his health was everywhere. In January 1965, it was beginning to diminish. On the roof, medics discovered an illness of his mouth and conducted several tests. Subsequently, he had a heart attack in February. Assault on the 23rd, a few days later. He departed in peace in his armchair without any fanfare at the age of 74. No grand finale, just a quiet farewell. From the guy who created the world. Chuckle without uttering a single word. Church of the Hills hosted the funeral. It wasn't a huge thing in Los Angeles. Hollywood extravaganza, but it was packed with those individuals who truly admired Van Dijk's stick, which had developed. In his later years, those close to Laurel gave Van Dijk's eulogy consistently viewed him as. He recognized him as more than just a comical hero. Buster Keaton was a mentor and friend. Additionally, honoring someone he felt that he was one of his own kind. Was laid to rest at Hollywood's Forest Lawn Hills Cemetery, and even though he could have been gone, but his impact was felt everywhere. It was more than simply the 190 movies or the notoriety. His legacy was what he left behind. Hardy, they made each other laugh. And the design they produced for each. The comic trio that followed.